We are going to start talking today, guys, about complex numbers. Complex numbers have a real part and an imaginary part. Like I said to you guys last week, God bless you, on your test, you should not have gotten any imaginary, you should not have gotten any negatives underneath the square root on your test last week. Now, that could possibly be an option. So let's talk about complex numbers. Complex numbers. This is what a complex number is. It's written in the form A plus BI, okay? A is the real part, and the BI is the what part? Not fake. It's imaginary. Okay, good. How do you know that it's imaginary? What does it have with it? A little I, okay? I always write mine like little cursive-y kind of thing. This is standard form where the real part is first. Every number can be written as a complex number. Like if you have the whole number 7, right? That's a real number. You could write that as a complex number and it would be plus or minus 0i. If you had an imaginary number, say negative 4i, you could write that as a complex with a real part and imaginary and just put a 0 in front of it. So every number that we talk about that you guys have ever seen, you can write as a complex number with a real part and an imaginary part. It just so happens that with the real ones, you don't write the plus 0i and that sort of thing. But now we're going to be dealing with real and imaginary parts. So the square root of negative 1. If you guys ever take the square root of negative 1, the answer to that is I. If you have the square root of 4, your answer is 2. If you have the square root of negative 4, your answer is 2i, plus minus. All right, we'll talk more about that in a second. How did that come about? Well, if you have I squared equals negative 1. That is a true fact. I squared equals negative 1. What happens? Yeah.
Is it plus minus?
What happens when you take, if you have something squared, you want to take the square root, yeah? So when you take the square root of one side, this becomes just I, and this becomes negative 1. So every time you guys see an I squared, and we're going to go over this, it's all we're going to work on today. Every time you see an I squared, I want you to cross it off and change it to a negative 1. And you'll see that in 1 second. When you're adding, subtracting, and multiplying, guys, treat I as a variable. We're going to combine like terms. Real, I always say this, real with real. And then you keep imaginary with what? Imaginary with imaginary, right? That's the best way to think of it. Real stays with real, imaginary stays with imaginary. And here is the standard form. A is your real part, and the BI is your imaginary part. The real part always goes first. Does everybody understand that? So if you look at this, why is this written in standard form? Because the real part is first and the imaginary part is second. How do you know the radical negative 25 is imaginary? Because there's a negative in here. And what we're going to talk about is you guys are going to simplify it. You're going to say, okay, when I don't know why I put plus or minus. When I break this up, I like to look at it as this is 25 times negative 1. Do you guys agree with me? And we're going to do more of this in a second. So this becomes 2 plus, well, what's the square root of 25? 5. And then what's the square root of negative 1? I. And that is your final answer. Why is that your final answer? Why can't we say it's 7i? Because they're not the same last name. Good. They're not the same. 2 is real. 5 is imaginary. So that's just what we're going to work on today. We're just going to work on adding, subtracting, and multiplying. So we got a whole bunch of examples here. So again, guys, if there wasn't an I there, if there was an X, you guys would have no problems doing this, right? We're going to treat it the same way. We just have to remember when we have I squared, we got to do something with it. So look, what is happening in between these two parentheses? We're adding, correct. We are not multiplying. You're not foiling here, guys. There is a plus sign in the middle. So we're just going to say, do I have to distribute that plus sign? No. Can I just go ahead and combine like terms like it is? Yes. I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it though without the parentheses. I'm going to take one extra step. So I have 4 plus 7i plus 1 minus 6i. And what did I say at the beginning? I'm going to say to you guys, real with what? So I'm going to say 4 and a positive 1. That sign that's in front stays with it. So what's 4 plus 1? 5. Good. And then imaginary with imaginary. What's 7i minus 6i? Just i. So it's a positive or negative? Yeah. So it's going to be, if you want to put the 1 in front of it, go ahead, but you don't have to. All right, you guys with me? If I go too fast, slow me down. All right, same thing. Look at the next one. What are we doing? Look in between the parentheses. What are we doing? We're adding, okay? So I don't have to distribute anything. I'm just going to rewrite. So 1 plus 2i plus 3 minus 2i. Real with real. What's 1 plus 3? 4. What happens when I have a positive 2i and a negative 2i? They cancel out, okay? If it says write your answer in standard A plus BI form, WebAssign might want you to do what? 4 plus what? 0i, because this is the real part, that's the imaginary. I would assume, and I will ask the other teachers how they want it, but I would assume we'd be fine with just 4. Ooh, my ankle just cracked. All right, now we're going to get into some that are a little more difficult. Nothing you guys can't handle, but what do you notice is going on here? We have some distribution to do. There's a minus sign. So I have to distribute a minus here. And where else do I have to distribute a minus? To the second one, correct? So take your time. Some of you got real messed up in your work on your test, and that's where you lost points because you couldn't follow what you were doing. Rewrite this. I'm going to rewrite this as 3i minus a negative becomes what? So plus 2 minus 3i, agreed? Minus 2, what? Minus 5i. Perfect. So now I want all the reals with the reals. So I have a positive 2 and a negative 2. What happens? Cancels. Good. 3i minus 3i cancels. So I'm left with just what? Minus 5i. If I wanted to write that in A plus BI form, what would go in front of it? There we go. Good job, guys. Very good. I'll tell you exactly how, like, if you need to write it like that, or if negative 5i is fine. Yeah. I gotta ask the others how, we're gonna expect you guys to write it. All right. Before we just start combining, what do we need to recognize? What's going on here? I have a negative I have to distribute here, correct? Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and rewrite. I have 3 plus 2i plus 4 minus i minus 7 minus I. You guys agree? Okay, so real with real. 3 plus 4 is, minus 7 is, perfect. 2i minus I, minus I. What happens here, guys? It's 0. Everything just cancels. So it's 0. I could also write it as 0 plus what? 0i. Could I write 0 minus 0i? Yep, same thing. Now, again, I will clarify how they want it. I'll look on WebAssign and see how they want it to. All right, how do we feel about adding and subtracting? Is this brand new to anybody? Okay, if it is, no worries. Welcome to complex. Okay, 5 starts something a little different. What is 5? Multiplication. We are distributing. So I have 4 times this and 4 times this. So what's 4 times negative 2? Negative 8, great. And then what's 4 times 3i? Plus 12i. Can I combine anything? No. One's real, one's imaginary. Am I written in standard form? Yes, you guys are good to go. Okay, scooting on over. All right, now is when we have to remember, guys. I'm going to put over here a little thing. I'm going to say I squared equals negative 1. Let's remember that. I'm going to say something every time. I'm going to say every time you guys see an I squared, cross it off and change the sign in front. You'll see why in a second. What are we doing in number 6? We are multiplying. Do you see how the 2 parentheses are stuck together? Yes? Okay, so we're going to FOIL. 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times 3i is 6i. Good. Negative I and 4 is negative 4i. And negative I and positive 3i is minus 3i squared. Now stop for 1 second. Every time you guys see an I squared, this is what I'm going to tell you to do. Watch. Cross it off and change the sign in front. Now let me show you why I tell you to do that. What did I tell you at the beginning? What did I write over there that I squared is equal to? So if you were to cross this out and make this a negative 1, you would then have to multiply negative 3 times negative 1, which is going to give you what? Positive 3. So every single time you guys have an I squared, I'm going to say cross it off, and change the sign in front. Because you're that's what you're doing. Whatever term is at the end, you're multiplying it by -1. You're just changing the sign. So now, guys, you should have real with real. What's 8 plus 3? 11. And what's 6i minus 4i? So plus 2i. Every time you see a negative or an I squared, what are we doing? Cross it off and change the sign. All right, let's look at number 7. Just look at it for a second. Do you guys notice anything?
It's all the same. It's the same. It's the same numbers, but it's plus and
Good. It's the same numbers, but it's plus or minus. If you guys had this, what do we call this? When we FOIL it together. It's going to become the what? Difference of squares, right? Same concept here. You're going to need this for tomorrow. If I multiply 3 times 3, what do I get? 9. What's 3 times negative 2i? Minus 6i. What's 2i times 3? Plus 6i. What's 2i minus negative 2i and a positive 2i? Minus 4i squared. Guys, do you see an I squared? What do we do? Cross it off and change the sign. Every time. So now we're going to say real with real. What's 9 plus 4? 13. What happens with my positive and negative 6i's? They cancel. So it's not the difference of perfect squares, but it's the same kind of pattern. When you multiply by what's called the conjugate, what happens to your i's? We multiplied 3 plus 2i, 3 minus 2i. Those are conjugates of each other. What happened to our i's? They canceled out. We're going to need that for tomorrow because would it be okay if you guys left this as an answer? No, why not? Because there's a square root in the denominator. You got to rationalize. Well, same thing's going to happen tomorrow. You cannot have i's in the denominator. So we're going to have to get the denominator to have no i's. We'll talk about that tomorrow. All right. What does this say?
3 plus 2i.
This says 3 plus 2i times 3 plus 2i. In this case, guys, should my i's cancel out? No. Okay. If you don't see that, no big deal. Multiply. What's 3 times 3? 9. 3 times 2i plus 6i. 2i times 3 plus 6i. 2i times 2i plus 4i squared. Oh, I see an I squared. What do? Cross it off and change the sign. So this now becomes 9 minus 4, which is 5. And then 6i plus 6i is positive 12i. Now, last week, because my pre-calc kids were doing graphing rational functions, I bought a whole bunch of color pencils. You are welcome to use my color pencils on a test or a quiz. Sometimes it's helpful. I know some of you boys look at me like, I'm not doing that. So don't. It's fine. But I'm saying if you want to use color pencils to like circle all of the real stuff with blue and the imaginary stuff with red, or when you're changing I squared and changing the sign in front, sometimes the colors help, especially since a lot of you use a lot of colors on Notability. It might be a helpful thing to do. If not, then just say no thank you. No worries. No skin off my back, just letting you know. All right, look in between the two parentheses. What are we doing? Multiplying, good. So 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 3i is plus 6i. Negative 4i and 3 is minus 12i, correct? And then what's negative 4i and a positive 3i? Well, in a second. Hold on. Let's talk about it in a second. Negative 4i and a positive 3i. Minus 12i squared. Now, I totally agree with you. It's going to be plus 12. I personally would go through the motions of doing that, then say, ooh, cross this off, change the sign. Just because if we start to skip steps, we might fumble a little bit. But if you're comfortable with that, again, personal choice. You guys do what you want. So now real with real, 6 plus 12 is 18. And then what's net positive 6i and a negative 12i? Negative 6i. Now, I know some of you are going to say, well, can't you factor out a 6 and make this a 3 minus I? Could you? Yes. Is there any reason to? No. So just leave it. Unless it says, like, factor out the GCF or something, just leave it. Don't complicate things for yourself. Some of you like to do that.
Can I switch mine?
It's
Yeah, can you give me like 1 minute?
All right.
Yeah, just let me do one more. All right, let's scoot along. We already talked about this, one of the examples, and we're going to use this tomorrow when we divide, okay? You're going to have to understand the concept of complex conjugates. It's the same numbers, but opposite signs. The reason we do this is so when you multiply them together, the i's disappear, and this is a shortcut. It's just going to be the first number squared plus the second squared. It's fine. If you see that, great. If not, no big deal. But understand, guys, the same number. So I'll talk about it in a second. What's the complex conjugate of 1 plus I? 1 minus I. So we're going to say 1 minus I, and then we're going to multiply. What's 1 times 1? 1. What's 1 times negative I? Negative I. What's I times 1? Plus I. And then what's I times negative I? Minus I squared, right? So as soon as you see that I squared, I'm going to cross it off and put a plus here. What number is there, guys? There's a 1, okay? So now real with real, 1 plus 1 is 2. What happens to your i's? They cancel. Every single time you multiply by complex conjugates, the i's should disappear. It's very important. If they don't, then you messed up a sign or something. Let's look at 11. 4 plus 3i would be our what? Complex conjugate. So I'm going to multiply by 4 plus 3i. So 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 3i is plus 12i. Negative 3i and 4 is minus 12i. And negative 3i and positive 3i is minus 9i squared. Yeah? Cross off that I squared. Change that sign. So you have 16 plus 9 is 25. And what happens to your 12 i's? They cancel. Okay, I want to do one more example. It's not on here. I'm just going to write it. Say you had... Right, negative 5i plus 3. And they said to multiply by the complex conjugate. All right, there's a couple ways you could do this. What's one way I could multiply by the complex conjugate? Just how it's written. How could I rewrite it? How could I multiply? It would be, say it again. You want to keep the terms the exact same. That's why I did this one. Good. You would keep negative 5i, right? But what changes? The minus 3. And then you could multiply that way if you wanted to. But whatever that first term is, if it's negative, keep it negative. You'd only change that second sign. Some of you are going to want to say, ooh, I don't like the way that's written. How could I rewrite negative 5i plus 3? 3 minus 5i, good. And then your complex conjugate would be what? 3 plus 5i. That's fine as well. But understand, what I want you guys to understand is the first term, if it's positive, keep it positive. If it's negative, keep it negative. That second sign is what changes. So if we were to FOIL this, let's FOIL the top. Negative 5i and a negative 5i is what? 25 what? Guys?
25i squared.
Okay, so then what happens here? Cross that off and change. Okay, so negative 5i and a negative 3i plus 15i. 3 and negative 5 is negative 15i, correct? And then 3 times negative 3 is? Negative 9, okay. So I have negative 25 and a negative 9 gives me? Negative 34, okay. So let's go in the bottom here. 3 times 3 is? 9. What's 3 times 5i? Plus what? Okay, plus 15i. What's negative 3i and positive 3i? Negative 15i. And then what does this become? Negative 25i squared. Cross this off and change. This crosses out. What do I get? Positive 34. Yeah? Now, I know that one of the signs is negative and one of them is positive. That's okay, because when you do this in your problem tomorrow, you'll see that the signs will work themselves out the way they're supposed to.
Wait, so is it okay with those two different problems? I know it's the same.
Yeah.
problem, but I was asking because why did you do two?
I was just saying, if it's written this way, you can leave it that way and multiply, or you can rewrite it. If you'd like it to be in standard form, that's fine. Tomorrow we're going to do a bunch of problems where you have to multiply by the conjugate in order to get the i's out of the denominator. And then if your denominator ends up negative, then something in the numerator will be negative where you cancel it out. You'll see it. All the signs will work themselves out. I just wanted you guys to see that you can do it either way. You good?